Okay, so let's start talking about the issue of torture. It's an ugly issue, but I think we should talk about it. It's debated, so we should try to get a handle on it, see what is going on here. Um, so I think before we start talking about torture and whether it's ever morally permissible, and if so, when, I think we ought to be clear what we mean by torture. It's often pretty blurry. We'll throw this word out. We won't really be precise about what we mean. And I think it's important that we are. So before we really get into the discussion, let's talk about what we mean by the term. So we'll talk about a few different meanings. We'll mainly talk about one meaning, but I think it's important to know about the other meanings of it. And it's important to know, even in the meaning we're using torture, exactly what context we might be thinking about it, what situations. So I think we might mean roughly three different things by torture. Shu talks about two different kinds. I would actually divide what he calls terroristic torture into two: terroristic torture and torture as punishment. What we'll be talking about, and when people talk about the torture debate, what they mean almost always is interrogational torture. But let's see what the other sorts are. So terroristic torture, Shu talks about this, and what he seems to have in mind is torture, used by some nasty regime, some nasty government to scare its opponents. This is the kind of thing the Nazis did. This is the kind of thing North Korea does right now, right? You really hurt people who challenge the regime in just nasty, terrible ways. There's really no legal constraints on it. It's just done. Now, I think we might actually distinguish that from what we might call torture as punishment. And the reason is, terroristic torture, there's no legal constraints on it. There's no supervision. The state can do whatever it wants. It can do these horrible things to people in back rooms. That might be different than torture as punishment. In the modern world, the states that use torture pretty much all use terroristic torture, but you can think of the past where there were punishments on the book, like whipping people or things like that. We might talk about that as torture as punishment, right? There's a set legal penalty. It's under some kind of supervision. It's not just that the state can do whatever it wants. In the past, in the colonies, America even used torture as punishment. There's not a huge difference here, but I think it is important to be precise. It is important to separate the two out. Now look, terroristic torture and torture as punishment, no decent country uses these, right? You think of these, you think of just textbook nasty countries, or you think of our more backward past, right? You think of terroristic torture, you think of somewhere like North Korea. You think of torture as punishment, you think of medieval times, right? These are backwards, these are nasty. Nobody really wants to bring these back, or at least nobody we ought to take seriously. These are different, and I guess I should point out, if you guys don't know, but you should, both of these are forbidden by the U.S. Constitution. We have no cruel and unusual punishments. Well, torture is by definition a cruel and unusual punishment, so torture as punishment is ruled out. Terroristic torture, that's not the kind of thing any decent country does, right? And torture by punishment, that's just backwards. That's something that also any decent country is going to have prohibitions on, and we do have legal prohibitions on these. That leaves us with interrogational torture. So terroristic torture, some nasty regime is trying to terrify somebody. They're making an example of him or her, trying to scare others. Torture is punishment. Somebody has committed a crime, and some kind of torture is the punishment. It's given out as a punishment for a crime. All right. Interrogational torture is different from both of those. Interrogational torture is, we think somebody knows something, he doesn't want to tell us, so we want to torture him to get him to tell us what he knows. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is the intention is different than torture as punishment or terroristic torture, right? In those, you're either trying to scare somebody or punish them. In interrogational torture, the intention is you want to hurt them until they tell you what they know. Now, again, interrogational torture, you can think of it being done in sort of two situations. You can think of it being done to people, run-of-the-mill criminals who've been captured in the U.S. doing something, or, even terrorists who've been captured in the U.S. doing something. Or you can think of it being done to prisoners of war, people who've been taken on the battlefield in somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, let's be clear, both forms of international torture, interrogational torture, not international torture, both forms of interrogational torture are forbidden by law. In the U.S., the police are legally prohibited, things go on, but they're not supposed to, from torturing suspects. You are not allowed to hurt suspects. The same goes, hopefully you guys remember from the Red Cross video, the same goes for prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are supposed to receive decent treatment. Well, interrogational torture certainly isn't decent treatment. So, as much as terroristic torture and torture as punishment are ruled out, interrogational punishment, both by domestic, American law and international law, is forbidden. Well, but people want to make exceptions to this. Why is that? And, if in case you guys are wondering, the U.S. is not unique in this. Practically, again, every country says the police can't torture suspects. Most every country has signed on to the Geneva Conventions, which says you are not supposed to torture prisoners of war. So very clearly illegal practically everywhere, but some people want to make an exception to this. Why is it? What kinds of arguments do they offer? So hopefully you guys understand what we mean by the different types of torture, different things we might mean. We're only talking about interrogational torture. We'll leave the other two behind because, again, just nobody who's serious or should be taken seriously argues that we should bring back the other two forms, right? And when we talk about international torture, I don't know why I keep saying international. When we talk about interrogational torture, we might mean two different settings. We might mean interrogational torture in the U.S. with people who were taken here, or we might mean it applied to prisoners of war. People who try to normalize it will more commonly argue for prisoners of war, but they'll argue for people who were taken both abroad and here, at least, in supposed cases of terrorism. So how do they argue for this? How do they say we should make an exception to this widespread rule against interrogational torture? Why do they think this? How do they argue for this? That's what we'll start talking about in the next slide. Okay, so the main way that people who want to challenge it challenge this prohibition on interrogational torture is the so-called ticking time bomb hypothetical. And there's a lot of ways to set this up. I think people are often pretty sloppy with it. But the basic idea is this. Imagine that you know a bomb has been planted, but you don't know where it is. You have someone in custody who has information. Should you torture this person? Well, the way this is supposed to work, again, people set this up all kinds of different ways. But the thought is, well, if you can torture this one person to save the lives of all the people who would be killed in this bombing, well, why don't you torture him? This features in philosophical essays. It also pops up in popular entertainment, right? I think it was a fairly common plot point on 24. I've never watched it, but, I think that was kind of like the plot of the week, right? Agent Kiefer Sutherland has to torture somebody to get information. I know he wasn't Agent Kiefer Sutherland in the show, but I honestly don't care enough to look it up. All right, but let's look closer at the ticking time bomb hypothetical, because I feel like people are often really sloppy in the way they talk about this, the way they treat it. I like the Shu essay I had you guys read. I don't think even Shu is careful enough about it. There's some good stuff going on here, but Shu ought to be a little more careful. Let's talk about different ways that different ticking time bomb hypotheticals might challenge this prohibition on torture. So I think the ticking time bomb hypothetical challenges prohibitions on torture in two different ways. And I think, there's two different sorts of ticking time bomb hypothetical, and we have to be careful how we set them up because the two of them challenge it in different ways. So the first way is you can imagine a ticking time bomb hypothetical that would allow torturing someone due to the exceptions we make on the use of violence for self-defense or defense of others. There are other ones that turn on purely utilitarian considerations. You do something terrible to someone to prevent something even more terrible happening elsewhere. Okay, so I think with these two hypotheticals, it'll help to give you guys two different versions of the hypothetical, each of which challenges the prohibition on torture in a different way. So here's the first one. Imagine that we capture some terrorist. We know he's planted a bomb. I don't know how we know he's planted it, but whatever, we do. Let's imagine that. We know he's planted a bomb, but we don't know where. You guys might be skeptical of the story. In the next series of slides, I'm going to push pretty hard on that skepticism, but let's just go with the story for now. So we know he's planted a bomb. We know it's going to go off and likely kill innocent people. It's, ticking time bomb. We don't know where the bomb is. Would we torture this person? My bet is that many people will say yes. And my bet is you will say yes more easily and more enthusiastically than you do in my second hypothetical. My second hypothetical, imagine that we have captured, let's imagine it's like the first one. We've captured the torturers, we've captured the terrorist, but we know he's a pretty hard case. We know this guy for whatever reason, we know he can take a lot of physical pain. He is not going to crack if we torture him. But we also know that he loves his daughter more than anything in the world. And we think, well, if we torture him, he's not going to talk. But if we torture his daughter, he very well might. We'll torture her and make him watch. She's a 6-year-old child. She hasn't done anything. She's as innocent can be. But he loves her. We'll torture her. He might very well crack if we do this. Now, what's your reaction to this second case? My bet is that in this second case, you're not going to be like, yeah, okay, do it. You probably are saying no. Now let me point out something interesting about the second case. If we make the consequences bad enough, my bet is you will waffle. if it's a regular bomb planted, somewhere in a mall in Chicago, a lot of you will say don't do it. Of course, you can't torture an innocent child. If we make it a nuclear bomb, about to go off in downtown New York, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people will be killed if it goes off. Some of you might start to waffle there, right? You might say, okay, yeah, that's terrible, but maybe, God help us, maybe we would do it. But I bet you're not comfortable with that, right? I bet you're uneasy, and you should be, right? So what's the difference between these two cases? Well, the important difference is the reason you might allow an exception to this prohibition on torture. Look, we generally, in pretty much Kantian lines, think that people deserve not to be used as a mere means, right? Shu talks a lot about this. Torturing somebody is the picture of using them as a mere means. But remember what we said with just war theory. We also think that when someone is a threat, if they are threatening the lives of an innocent person, we think that that puts an exception. We think, well, maybe then you can use violence against this person, even to the point of killing them. Killing a person normally, like torture, is a textbook definition of using them as a mere means. Kantianism wouldn't allow it. Any deontological theory wouldn't allow it. But if that person is a threat to somebody else's life, well, you might very well allow it. Well, interestingly, I think that that's what this ticking time bomb, that's the sort of thing that the first ticking time bomb hypothetical trips, this sort of thought there. Now, I think Shu, the essay's pretty good, but I think he's a little confused on just war theory and why it allows the use of force. Just war, Shu almost seems to think of just war theory in terms of a fair fight or a boxing match. Think back to Anscombe's talk about Queensberry rules. I think this is a confusion, right? In a boxing match, of course you wouldn't put a flyweight in there with a heavyweight. That's not fair. We shouldn't let the heavyweight just kill this guy, right? And Shu thinks, well, just war theory, we allow exceptions to violence here because it's kind of fair. Both sides can hurt each other. But once you've captured somebody, he can't, it's not sporting anymore. He's like the flyweight against the heavyweight. He can't fight back. I think there's a confusion there. In just war theory, we allow the use of force because the one party is a threat. And if someone's a threat, even if what the threat they can bring to bear on you is much, much less than yours, they're still a legitimate target. I mean, think of it in these terms, right? In a war, by the end of World War II, the German army was greatly outmatched by the American army. That didn't mean, it wasn't sporting anymore, the Americans should stop. Or think of a self-defense situation. If someone is running at you with a knife and you have a shotgun, well, in a sense it's not fair. A shotgun is a lot more dangerous than a knife, but if he's running at you with a knife, we would think you're allowed to shoot him. He's a threat to you, even though you have a lot more power than he does. Well, in this first ticking time bomb hypothetical, something weird's happening, right? Even though we've captured the terrorist, he's still in a very real sense a threat to other people. He's done an action, but by the weird way he's done it, it's going to take some time to play out. The bomb is a time bomb. It's not went off yet. So I think in this first ticking time bomb hypothetical, we might think, oh, okay, he's threatening others. That allows us to use violence against him. You know, if he had his finger on a button and was going to blow up 50 innocent people, we would certainly think we were justified, someone would be justified in shooting him. Well, if you can kill someone, well, then why couldn't you torture them? Look, getting tortured is bad, getting killed is a lot worse. The second sort of case is entirely different, though. In this case, we are torturing an innocent person, someone who's no threat to anyone else, to prevent something terrible from happening. In this second case of torture, this looks very much like Anscombe's example of boiling a baby alive to prevent something terrible. And the thing is, as I said last time, if what you were preventing was terrible enough, you might very well do it. But in some sense, it ought to make you sick. In some sense, you ought to think it's not right. And the consequences would have to be pretty terrible. Most of us wouldn't do it to save 50 people. Most of us probably wouldn't do it to save 100. 100,000 or 1,000,000, maybe. And it would make our stomachs sick if we were not a sociopath. But for small numbers, we wouldn't do it. And I think Shu confuses these two cases. He thinks that the ticking time bomb always works on utilitarian considerations. I think he's wrong. I think that sometimes it works on these self-defense considerations, at least in the hypothetical. But let's see how significant that is in the real world. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide, and that'll be pretty much the continuous theme of the next slideshow, which hopefully by then, you guys will have watched the Frontline episode, which I think will give some more real-world context to this. Okay, so I'm gonna hammer the point from the last slide home just a little bit more before finishing, because I do think it is an important point, and I also think it's a tricky point. And if we're gonna talk about what this ticking time bomb hypothetical might prove and what it doesn't, we have to be clear on this point. So there's two very different cases, and they work on two very different sorts of reactions. So the first case, and these track the two cases in my previous example, torturing someone to prevent something he's set in motion from harming someone else. Torturing someone to stop harms that others might do to someone. And I think the first one is much, much easier to justify on sort of Kantian or other deontological considerations. And I think for most of us, the first one is easier to justify. The second one is justified on purely utilitarian grounds. And for me, at least, the second one is much harder to justify, even if we don't make the person as innocent and sympathetic as the child in my previous case. So just to get us a handle on this one, let's take two more different but related cases. Now, the first of these is actually taken from an article on torture, the Stanford Encyclopedia article. It's a pretty good article. Maybe take a look at it if you have time. But anyway, imagine this. Imagine that someone carjacks a mother with a child in the back seat of her car, very hot day, and takes, goes off with the car. He doesn't realize that there's a child in the back. He realizes the police are after him. He abandons the car. They catch him, and they don't know where the child is. It's a very hot day. Well, they're worried about the child in the car. If it's somewhere where it's getting hot, she might very well die or suffer brain damage or something of that sort. Should the police beat this guy? They've asked him. He's not going to say otherwise. Should they try to beat the information out of him? Well, look, notice that in this case, as with the ticking time bomb, the guy who stole this car has set a chain of events in motion that's going to result in the harm of an innocent person. He is the direct cause of this child being in danger. And I don't know what we should think about the legal status of this for reasons I'll get into in the next slide and definitely the next presentation. I think even cases like this, from a legal standpoint, what our laws should be like, prove a lot less than they might seem to. But from a moral standpoint, it's hard to argue if it really is necessary against beating the information out of this guy. And why is that? Well, look, imagine he'd stolen the car and he's driving hell for leather trying to get away from the police. And he's getting ready to drive down, speeding like crazy. You know, he's going into a residential neighborhood or a school zone where there might be children out. Would the police be justified in putting up spikes or something to stop him from driving like this, even though it might cause him to wreck and kill him? I think we would all say they are, right? He's threatening innocent lives by what he's doing. If that's the case, well, force, even deadly force, might be permissible. Well, if that's the case, if we would think in a slightly different case it's justified to kill him, why would it not be justifiable to beat him up, to torture him, to use that kind of force on this guy? I think it's hard, at least from a purely moral standpoint, to say why it isn't. Here's a different case, though. Imagine that, you know, we have arrested a mobster. He's been in jail, you know, for a while, you know, a year or so. We know he hasn't planned anything that his former group is doing, but we also know that he has a lot of information on them he hasn't told us. Well, his former associates go and kidnap a child. He wasn't involved in this at all. He did nothing to plan it. But we think, oh, okay, this guy probably knows where they're hiding him. This guy knows where they're hiding him. Let's imagine that this child has some sort of medical needs that, you know, we don't think the people who kidnapped him are meeting. We think his life's in danger. You know, they're not giving him his medicine, but what's more, you know, they might just kill him. Well, should we torture the guy we have in custody? Now look, even if this guy was a mobster, even if he was not a very nice person, for me, this is a much harder thing to justify. Why is that? Well, he's not as sympathetic as the little girl in my previous example, but notice something similar is going on. He played no role in directly setting this up, but we are torturing him to stop the harms that others might do to someone. We're trying to get information out of him so we can stop his former associates from doing something, but he's not set this in motion. He's not the cause of what's happened. We are not defending others from his actions. We are just torturing him to prevent bad things from happening. The first case seems like this sort of torture is allowed even under Kantian theory, because Kantianism will allow some exceptions for the use of force against people who are threatening others through their actions. The second one is not justified under Kantian theory. We are using this person as a mere means to stop his former accomplices from doing something. Even if he is not as sympathetic as my previous example, Kantian theory would say this is clearly forbidden. You can't do this. I personally think it's a lot harder to justify torture in the second case. Well, question I want to ask you, real cases in the real world where we're thinking about using torture or we're claiming that we need to use torture, which do they look more like? My first case or my second? Well, think about that. If it's the first case, it might be easier to justify. If it's the second, much harder. Ticking time bomb hypothetical. If it's the second sort of ticking time bomb hypothetical, our reactions to it, I imagine, at least for me, are much less clear than our reactions to the first sort. So the second sort of ticking time bomb hypothetical, in that our reactions are much less clear, I think proves much less. But let's finish this. Let's finish with a few points. What does the ticking time bomb hypothetical in either form prove? What does it not? So just a few quick thoughts to finish with, and just these are kind of to prep you guys for watching the movie and to pick up some themes that I'll talk about in the next presentation. What the hypothetical proves and what it doesn't. Well, it proves that in some hypothetical cases, imaginary cases, torture might be morally justified. We philosophers, we're a clever bunch. We can tell you these sci-fi stories. We can tell you really weird cases where torture seems morally justified because somebody has done something to threaten others and we now have this guy in custody. Well, but the question you ought to ask is, well, I can tell you a story, but are there real-world cases that look like that story? I haven't given you any real-world cases yet where torture is justified. Well, just because I can tell you a story doesn't mean it applies to the real world. As much as we've proven so far, this might just be a really inventive bit of literature, right? And look, one thing I want to bang the table on, you can't go from stories to thinking the real world is like that. Just because Agent Kiefer Sutherland saves us all week by torturing people doesn't mean that that's ever happened. Now, I know most people are too smart to do this, but I always have someone who quotes a fictional story as proof that we need to have torture. Look, you might as well use The Hobbit to show that we need to have some sort of policy to take care of dragons. Until yes, the fictional stories might say that there are imaginary cases where we could justify this, but you still need to show that there are in fact real-world cases that look like this. If there aren't, then yeah, maybe the ticking time bomb hypothetical sets up some great TV drama. Maybe it's fun for philosophers to talk about. But what does it prove about the real world? You still need to bridge the gap and show me that there are real-world cases that look like this. Especially that look like the first sort of ticking time bomb hypothetical, where we have the guy who set events in motion that will harm others, and well, torturing him might prevent it. Second sort of ticking time bomb hypothetical, where we can torture somebody who's not involved to maybe stop what his or her associates are doing. That's much more controversial, and I want you guys to ask yourselves, what do real world cases where people are advocating for torture, what do they look more like? I'll talk a lot more about that in the next slideshow, but keep that in mind. And look, one final point, and I'll talk a lot more about this in the next slideshow, even if you can show me real-world cases where torture is acceptable, that does not prove we should change the law. There's a saying among lawyers, weird cases make bad law, or different versions of it, but look, the law is meant to cover what generally happens. Well, if we legalize torture or make some exceptions for it, for weird cases, even if they're real cases, might that not have bad effects in cases that are much more common? So I think it's a jump to say, even if we could show real cases like this happen, Well, it's still a jump to think that we need a policy making legal exceptions, loosening legal restrictions on torture. Now, I know these last few points have come really quick. I'll talk a lot more about every one of them in the next presentation. First, I want you guys to watch the Frontline episode to provide some real context for this.